Hello, my name is Emily and my project is on the Extensor Digitorum Communis tendon. We're going to focus how it affects the finger, although it does play a role in wrist extension and flexion as well. So, this presentation will cover the anatomic structure, the composition and microstructures, the loading states, mechanical behavior, methods of the measurement, and the citations will be at the end. Starting from the beginning, we have a right human hand in the dorsal view. When you see a figure or an image of a hand, it will be in the dorsal plane unless otherwise specified. Now, we're going to take a look at the bones of the fingers. Here we can see all 16 bones of the fingers, and I will argue that the thumb is not a finger, so it's not included. Starting at the lowest level, we have the metacarpal bones. These join the carpal bones in our lower hand and wrist to our proximal phalanges. If you're unfamiliar, proximal means that it's in proximity to your trunk, and distal means that it's at a distance from your trunk. So, after we have the middle phalanges that are connecting the proximal to the farthest set, the distal phalanges. It's important to know the names of the bones because they directly correlate to the joints of the fingers. The connecting joint between our metacarpals and our proximal phalanges is our metacarpal phalangeal joint. Thankfully, that is abbreviated to MCP joint. The naming convention is true for the rest of the finger joints. The name for the joint corresponds to the joint above. The next set of joints, therefore, is the proximal interphalangeal joints and the distal interphalangeal joints, which are abbreviated to PIP and DIP. A trick that a physical therapist taught me for remembering the difference between PIP and DIP is that you use your farthest point of your finger to dip. We use our dip to dip into sauce for tasting. Now that we know the bony anatomy of the fingers, we will begin to look at the tendon structures. This will be a general overview of the tendon structure in the finger. It will not be digit specific. The tendon in charge of finger extension is our Extensor Digitorum Communis, also abbreviated to EDC. I will be using those terms interchangeably throughout this presentation. Above the MCP joint, we see that it diverges into three different branches: the central slip and the lateral bands. The central slip attaches just above the PIP joint. The lateral bands travel laterally along the proximal interphalange and medial interphalange to attach at the distal phalange. The sagittal band wraps all the way around the finger to keep the central tendon from slipping off of the MCP joint. The triangular ligament holds the lateral bands in their places to prevent slipping as well. These are both static components of connective tissue that limit the movement of the tendon. The last ligament that we'll discuss in this system is the oblique ligament of Landseer. This originates at the palmar side of the MCP joint, transitions to the dorsal side at the PIP attachment point. It's a static component in the tendon extensor system, but it's crucial to coordinating the DIP and PIP joint extension. So here are a couple of different measurements for these components. The lateral bands are around 38 millimeters each, and the central slip is around 32 millimeters. The triangular ligament is about 5.4 millimeters in length across the joint, and the oblique ligament of Landseer, that one is around 15 millimeters. The sagittal band is about 18 millimeters in length, about 1.19 millimeters thick, and this one did have a modulus of elasticity listed, which was 64.87 megapascals. To understand the composition and microstructure of the tendon, I think it's best to start with the overall structure's function. The function of a tendon is to transfer the force of a muscle to the bone. The connection point between the two is a specialized tissue known as enthesis. This tissue is about 100 times stiffer than the proper tendon, and it's an extremely complex tissue that we will not be getting into in this presentation. However, it is this stiff because it needs to transition the more elastic tendon to the extremely rigid, non-elastic bone. Looking at the microstructural hierarchy of the tendon, we can see that the largest unit and the smallest unit are pictured below. Right below the whole tendon, we have the group of fascicles. They're joined together and innervated by the cardiovascular and nervous system. The next is the smallest unit, which is the collagen fiber. These are groups of type 1 collagen. The elasticity of the tendon comes from the mechanical properties of type 1 collagen. Type 1 is the most abundant form of collagen, making about 90% of the collagen in the tendon. The other 10% is predominantly type 3, and even smaller is types 4 and 5. Type 3 collagen contributes to the fibrogenesis by regulating the size of collagen type 1 fibrils. There are additional structures in its composition. We can identify these by dissecting the hierarchy of the tendon. And I also want to note that the collagen in a tendon is highly organized. It's entirely parallel and in plane with the long axis. When you look at the fibrils along the axis in a scanning electron microscope picture, we can see the banding. This is called debanding. We will come back to this later. Tenocytes are found on the outside and inside of tendon fascicles, which are the compartments of the tendons. Their purpose is to provide structure in the ECM, link cells, transfer materials through gap junctions, and are fibrocytes of the tendon. Their shape are crucial for the overall mechanical function of the tendon. If they lose their long, elongated shape due to mechanical or chemical receptor input, the mechanical properties of the overall tendon will be affected. This structure is not pictured in the hierarchy diagram. However, I did add a green arrow to call it out. They are found in the intrafascicular matrix. Glycoproteins such as elastin and decorin are important for the collagen fiber's mechanical properties. Decorin's function has multiple theories. One is assisting with alignment and slippage between fibers. Another theory, transfer of load between collagen fibrils that are disconnected through small intrafibril bridges. Elastin assists with the stability of the tendon and provides fatigue resistance along with energy storage. Concentrations vary from 1 to 10% of tendon's dry weight. It also encourages recoil, which is especially important for an extensor tendon. I want to note that the total concentration of elastin in a tendon is magnitudes lower than that of a ligament, which makes a big difference in their overall mechanical properties. The last and arguably most mechanically important element of the microstructure I want to highlight is the crimping of collagen fibers. This is a scanning electron microscope image of a pig's Achilles tendon. The scale bars from left to right are 500 micron, 30 micron, and 1 micron. In the middle, we see the crimping of those collagen fibers extremely well. The crimp has a large impact on the mechanical properties of tendons as it allows the fibers to expand. This form of energy storage is dependent on the crimp angles. A smaller angle indicates a tighter crimp and more energy storage. A larger crimp angle stores less energy. To demonstrate how the tendon transmits force into the phalanges, I have made this model. This is a 3D model for the finger, and it was made by InMove, which is an open source humanoid robot project. Inside the finger, there are 2 strings running palmar and dorsal to the finger. I tied both of these off in equal tension on both sides. I then attached loops to the EDC tendon attachment points on the phalanges and ligament attachment points. It's not a perfect model, but it is close enough for our purposes. In this image, I am pulling on the central slip, seen in green, and both the lateral bands, seen in blue. Notice how motion begins at the MCP joint and then transitions down the PIP and DIP joints. In a healthy hand, motion begins proximally and extends distally. If the opposite occurs, this is a condition known as ulnar palsy. In the next GIF, I am pulling on only the central slip. This demonstrates that the load for the PIP joint is reliant on the central slip's connection. It has no contribution to DIP extension. The MCP joint only extends with the central slip engaged in the demonstration. But in real life, if you only had the central slip, it would not be able to transmit enough force for full MCP extension. Looking at the mechanics in an anatomical drawing, we can further examine the loading states. This pulley system favors the MCP joint because of the metacarpal bone. The metacarpal bone is the first and longest moment arm in the system. Its head diameter is also the largest at 10 millimeters. The next moment arm is the proximal phalange. It's a smaller moment arm than the metacarpal as its head diameter is 7.5 millimeters. This is maximum while the moment arm is in extension. We will discuss how this moment arm changes during flexion. Finally, the moment arm in the middle phalange is the smaller head of 5 millimeters. Using our knowledge of mechanics, we know that the system will begin with the largest moment arm, then the medium, and finally the smallest, as the image demonstrates to the left. This is true for both extension and flexion of the finger. If we were to lose a component of the extensor tendon, we would lose that connection to our moment arms. If we lost the connection between the central slip and the median phalange, we lose control over the extension of the PIP. I like to think of this as the flexor tendon's moment arm becoming dominant. They should balance each other out, but we cannot balance it if we lose the extension moment arm on the PIP joint. This also affects the MCP joint's moment arm. The MCP will favor extension when the PIP is extended, as the lateral bands exert more force on the joint than the central slip does. Clinically, this is known as a boutonniere deformity, and it requires surgical intervention to be repaired. If we had a detachment of the lateral band from the distal phalange, we lose our moment arm for the DIP joint. Again, the flexor system becomes dominant, and the central band becomes the only mechanism for MCP extension, which, as we said before, is not a very strong mechanism. When we have this detachment, it is called a mallet finger deformity. I have an at-home experiment for you to try to feel the lateral band's impact on the DIP joint. If you extend just your pointer finger and attempt to flex and extend only the DIP joint, you cannot. This is because all the moment arms are connected in the system. Since this tendon goes lateral, we can pinch our DIP joint to stop the central slip and its associated moment arm. Now that it's pinched, try to flex or extend the DIP and you will be able to. If you repeat this isolated flexion, you will begin to feel a physical impact along the sides of your finger and the intrinsic muscles of the hand. If you were to repeat this multiple times a day, every day, you would be making your DIP joint very strong. All of this is to prove how the lateral bands also participate in the flexion of IP joints. Let's look at the drawing in C over here. As we flex, the moment arm for the PIP joint decreases. This is because the lateral bands in green travel closer to the center of the joint. The size of the moment arm is seen in the inner green circle of the PIP joint. Compare that to the moment arm in B, which is in full extension. The moment arm is at its maximum size and the DIP joint is fully extended. Now, looking at A, this is a finger in a resting position, which is a partial flexion. Our moment arm is balanced between the central slip and the lateral bands. There's partial extension of the DIP joint. What does the loading state look like on a microscale? Well, we see the crimping of the collagen fibers expand. This picture comes from a ligament's type 1 collagen fibers, which are equivalent to a tendon in our case. The ligament was a rabbit leg that was loaded into a testing fixture seen on the left. Strain gauges were applied and flexion initiated. On the right here, we can see how the filaments responded to the strain. These lines are the debanding of the collagen fibrils. When the filament was strained, we can see the crimping straighten out, adding length to the collagen fibers and therefore the tendon. The change in length the banding experiences is a key mechanical property of the tendon. In our case, with the EDC, we do not need a large length in banding. This is thanks to the surrounding ligament structures and the lateral bands shifting during flexion. We also do not have a large range of motion with extension compared to other tendons, especially in the feet. Let's begin to look deeper into this relationship between stress and strain. Our stress-strain relationship can be tied to the straightening of crimped collagen fibers. In the toe region, our collagen fibers begin to expand and straighten out. This occurs at about 2% strain. Next, the linear region. This is where our fibers are fully straightened out. This is a normal physiological function region of the stress-strain curve that the EDC experiences. Everyday activities, it's within the range of 2 to 4% strain. Now, we have strain that occurs outside of normal everyday activities. At the microscopic failure level, we may be having an especially challenging day of strength training, but we will not have plastic deformation and the crimping will go back to mostly normal after exercising and resting. But after that, we start to get into the danger zone. Between 4 to 8% strain, we begin to damage our tendon fibrils, crimp, and plastically deform their structure. They will not return to their resting state as they once were. This impacts the stiffness of the overall tendon and is a negative impact on the tendon. Eventually, when we get to over 10%, we will have rupture. Rupture can be either load or time dependent. As we can see, the rate of elongation and changing load that it applies affects the stiffness of the tendon. At relaxation, the tendon is not stiff. You can see and feel this physically with the EDC because it's so close to the surface of the skin. I want you to relax your hand and feel for the tendons on the back of your hand. It's hard to identify them. Now, bend your wrist backwards and start to wiggle one of your fingers. As your finger moves, you can see and feel the tendon becoming stiffer. We can calculate the ultimate load of the EDC by measuring the maximum elongation and the maximum load. I hope you're beginning to catch on to the overall properties of the tendon after I show you this graph here. Tendons also exhibit creep. As the constant load is applied, it does not elongate much, like an elastic structure does. So, this is a viscoelastic structure in the body. It experiences stress relaxation and hysteresis when repeatedly loaded. The load level, which is both time and force dependent due to its viscoelastic properties, has a big impact on the tendon structure. When a tendon receives little load for little amounts of time, the overall tensile strength, size, collagen production, and anabolic activities decrease. Catabolic activities increase. During moderate mechanical levels, we see an increase in tensile strength, an increase in collagen synthesis, decrease in collagen degradation, lower adhesions to the bone and muscle around it, decreased inflammatory responses, and more tenocytes building more structures within the tendon. If we experience excessive amounts of mechanical loading, the tensile strength is decreased, collagen organization becomes much lower, and we get more perpendicular fibers rather than parallel ones. There's an increase in myofibroblasts, increase in inflammatory mediators, an increase in TSCs differentiating into non-tenocytes, and an increase in edema. It is challenging to find data on the EDC because it's not a very well-studied piece of anatomy. Typically, people focus on the flexor tendons of the hand, but I did find one cadaver study in 2014. They took 19 samples and used a custom materials testing system to obtain a set of standard mechanical properties. They did not measure it by structure, rather, they chose to measure it in segments. A few that I want to highlight are the differences in the values proximal versus distal. I am only going to look at the local measurements, not the values measured by the clamping system. The ultimate strain at the MCP is the highest of all the values at 36%. And the lowest value seen was at the distal central slip with 23%. The other value difference that I wanted to highlight was the ultimate loads. The ultimate load before the MCP joint is double that of the lateral bands, despite it being 2/3 of the original EDC before it diverges into central and lateral bands. One final note on this data is that the margin of error is very large. Therefore, we should take it with a grain of salt. We are now going to discuss some methods of measurement. This was a simulated model of the finger extensor system, and it helped distinguish how different muscles of the hand transmit loads in the extensor tendon components. The posture of the finger had a direct impact on all the tendon component loading states. You can see them in the picture of the right. On the right. In a healthy finger, we see that the highest force transmission in posture B was at the distal lateral bands, and this was around 8 newtons of force. The scale bar can be seen on the far right. The lowest force transmission were in the ligaments, which you can see in all of the postures, and they're almost all the way black. This modeling is great as we can adjust the variables for, say, a stiff hand and see how it impacts the neighboring structures. Treatments could be adjusted to retrain the neighboring structures along with the structure of interest. This could potentially speed up the recovery and create a stronger overall system, preventing re-injuring the hand. So to give you an idea of where we're starting, there is no clinical test in vivo to measure tendon stress in a living person. There are physical exams that hand therapists use to measure the range of motion in a finger, and isolation tests where we pinched our finger to isolate just the DIP motion. But there is no diagnostic test that tells us the tendon's composition and stress status. So we're going to look at this experimental study. This study measured the human EDC tendon using shear wave elastography in both extension and flexion. The test setup can be seen on the left. The hand was placed into the fixture, a load cell applied at the moment arm, an ultrasound transducer placed right below the MCP joint, which is before the EDC diverges into central and lateral slips. The vibration tool at 250 Hz was applied at a 45-degree angle. In the first test, they asked the subjects to extend their finger, and in the second test, they were asked to flex their finger. You can see that in image A and image B on the left. If we think back to the mechanical properties of the tendon, we know that with an increased load, we can see increased stiffness. This is how the shear wave penetrates the tissue and can be seen in the shear wave propagation. I also wanted to highlight on the ultrasound image to the right where the extensor tendon begins and the extensor tendon ends. The shear wave propagation can be seen in this video below. I have added brown bars to show where the extensor tendon is in the depth range. They found that the shear wave velocity increased in the EDC tendon during extension and flexion. They hope to use these values to compare with injured tendon recoveries. They want to measure stiffness to predict functional outcomes and implement early interventions to prevent further damage to the tendon extensor system. The results of the study found the maximum force in both extension and flexion of the human EDC tendon. I would like to note that the force values were exceptionally higher during flexion when compared to extension. Another interesting finding was the cross-sectional area being highly variable. The subjects in this study were 5 men within the same age range, around 23 years old. The fact that there is such a big difference between the cross-sectional area was an interesting finding to me. Unfortunately, the authors did not calculate the Young's modulus with their experiments on humans. However, in their paper, they did a similar experiment with superficial extensor tendon of pig toes. They did calculate the Young's modulus with this experiment, which averaged out to be around 40.2 megapascals. I predict that the reason why there was such a big difference between the Young's modulus was because they harvested these samples from a slaughterhouse. Most likely, the feet were already detached from the pig's body, and they did not choose pigs with similar muscle and therefore tendon tone. And with that, that concludes our presentation on the EDC tendon. We covered all aspects of the tendon, both anatomically and mechanically. We looked into some of the new ways, such as shear wave elastography, as a method of quantifying stress states during different extension and flexion points of the tendon. We were able to create a model of the EDC and see how different disease states impact the anatomical function of the finger. I also wanted to point out that we were unable to find the Young's modulus for the EDC as an entire structure. Rather, we were able to find the final stress states of ultimate loading using cadaver samples, which is one of the biggest problems with studying the EDC tendon, is that most of the studies are done on cadaver parts, which are not very similar to anatomic loading states we see, as the samples are highly processed and at times detached from the bones themselves. So, in the future, I think it would be fantastic to pursue more shear wave elastography studies, potentially with activities of daily living as a central focal point, seeing how the Extensor Digitorum Communis affects grasp types, and hopefully translate those to more applications of everyday living. Thank you for listening.